Perfect, perfect. So welcome everyone and good evening, or if you are joining us from Asia, good morning. Thank you very much for being here today for our World Speaks Space event on Asia. My name is Jess Rogers. I am the current vice chair of the American Society of International Law's Space Law Interest Group. And with me, I have Stefan Kirchner, who is the co-chair of the interest group with me. Stefan, do you want to quickly say hi?
Thanks a lot, Jess. Welcome everybody to this installment of World Speak Space. It's a series of webinars we're organizing, and we're really happy to have a very nice mix of people, of experts from different countries here tonight. And yeah, on behalf of the interest group, welcome.
Thanks, Stefan. So just for everyone's awareness, this is a very inconvenient time for a lot of people, since we try to bridge the times for Asia, for Europe, for the US. So we're recording the event for anyone to watch this afterwards, and hope this will be a helpful resource for space law in Asia. The Space Law Interest Group in ASIL really is a forum, a resource, a community for scholars and practitioners of international law, on the use and exploration of outer space. So we use this as a forum for the exchange of ideas, and we host a couple of events every year, and also have interest group meetings once a year with the annual meeting of ASIL. So if you're not a member yet, we welcome anyone to join wherever you are in the world. So please look us up. We also have a Twitter page now, which we will put into the chat at the end of today, where you can follow us for updates on any new events. So welcome to this World Speaks Space series finale, like I like to call it. This is the last one of our events, and now we've landed in Asia geographically. I'm wondering if anyone from the participant side has attended any of our other World Speaks Space series events. If you have, do you mind putting a 1 into the chat? I don't see anyone yet, so I'm going to assume these are new folks who are particularly interested in Asia, so that's exciting. So we're delighted to have 3 highly qualified space law experts from Asia with us today. We have Professor Dr. Setsuko Aoki, who is professor of law at Keio University Law School and is Japan's leading expert on international space law. She had authored, for example, in the Routledge Handbook of Space Law, and we're very pleased to have you with us today, Dr. Aoki. We also have Dr. Ranjana Kaur, who is an attorney with Dua Associates in New Delhi. She specializes in the international law of outer space and advises on commercial satellite services. She just told us before our meeting started that the background is one of her new organizations, private sector organizations, a think tank for space law and space activities in India. She's affiliated with the International Institute of Space Law in Paris and was awarded the 2017 Distinguished Services Award from the Institute. Finally, we also have Dr. Fabio Tronchetti, who is the co-director of the Institute of Space Law and Strategy and an associate professor at Beiyang University in Beijing. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Mississippi, so tackling 2 universities. And he, together with Franz van der Dunk, which some of our Americans or generally space law experts might know, he has co-edited the Elgar Handbook of Space Law. So welcome to all 3 of our distinguished speakers today. We're very excited to have you with us. We will dedicate a few minutes, about 4 minutes, to opening statements per speaker, where I welcome you to share any updates on your country's space law frameworks, any regulatory legislative developments, and generally give some of our participants who might not be as familiar with space law in your countries a little bit of background. So I will start with Dr. Aoki, please, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for your kind introduction. So thank you so much giving me this precious opportunity to speak on the space law development in Japan. Well, let me briefly touch upon national space legislation in Japan with the focus of its characteristics. It was in 2008 when Japan first made its National Space Act entitled the Basic Space Act. In fact, this was more the declaration of Japan's space policy than law to license and supervise private space activities. Basic Space Act is important in 2 points, however. The first point is the termination of the interpretation that peaceful use of space equating with non-military use, so that satellite could also be used for defense purposes. The second point is that the determination to commercialize and privatize space activities. In 2016, 2 national space acts for authorization and supervision were promulgated. They were Space Activities Act and the Satellite Remote Sensing Data Act. The scope of the Space Activities Act is the launch of a rocket with satellites and the operation of spacecraft. The scope of Remote Sensing Data Act is the use of the high-resolution sensors and the dissemination of sensed data. For the both Space Acts, the strict territoriality principle is taken. Irrespective of the nationality, a private person who intends to launch a rocket under the Japanese jurisdiction needs a launch permit from the Prime Minister. A private person who intends to operate a spacecraft using the command and control facility located in Japan must obtain a license from the Prime Minister. The same territoriality principle applies to the Remote Sensing Data Act. Thus, a Japanese private person who doesn't use Japanese territory for launch or the operation of spacecraft doesn't have to obtain a permit or license. The scope of operation of spacecraft is wide in content. It also includes the operation of spacecraft to exploit and extract space resources on the celestial bodies, and the on-orbit servicing, as long as the command and control facility for such activities is located in Japan. This means that without a separate act, space resource exploration and exploitation can be licensed under the Space Activities Act. However, because the condition to grant license and the method of supervision would be greatly different from the operation of communication or remote sensing satellites, the separate act on the promotion of space activities for exploration and exploitation of space resources was made into law last year, June of 2021. This is a separate act, but not completely an independent act. This was made as an additional law to the part of the operation of space activities, spacecraft in the Space Activities Act. So an applicant for a license of the space resources exploitation shall satisfy all conditions under the Space Activities Act and the conditions specifically required for the space resources exploitation. According to the Space Resources Act, a license acquires ownership of space resources that have been extracted when the licensee observes this act and possesses the space resources with the intention to own. Finally, let me slightly touch upon the latest guidelines of Space Activities Act that was entered into force last year. This guideline details the conditions for on-orbit servicing, including especially active space debris removal. On-orbit servicing is one of the activities of the operation of spacecraft, and the government decision was that a separate act was not needed in this case, as on-orbit servicing is yet similar to the normal operation of satellite, different from the case of space resources extraction. In conclusion, Japan has 3 national space acts to provide authorization and supervision, and the Space Resources Act is an additional act to the Space Activities Act. Other new activities on orbit are regulated through guidelines made under the Space Activities Act. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aoki. That was a great overview of Japan's regulatory regime for space. I will hand it over to Dr. Kaul now for your opening statement. I believe she might have lost connection.
She's just reconnecting right now.
No, not a problem. I think we will just hand it right back to Dr. Tronchetti and get back to Dr. Kou when she's with us again.
Oh, okay. So shall I go?
Yes, please feel
Oh,
free.
all right. Okay, okay. No problem. Okay, so first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the kind invitation. So I'd like to share a few thoughts about China and the Chinese space program and latest development. So to start off, I can say that it is certainly undeniable that China over the past 20 years have made so remarkable leap forwards in the space sector and has thus become one of the leading spacefaring nations. China possesses now the capability to independently launch objects in all orbits and the ability to provide all sorts of space-based services, not only to fulfill domestic needs, but also to serve the interest of foreign customers. Some of the highlights of this remarkable process of growth are certainly the ongoing Mars mission, the building of the Chinese space station, the successful collection of samples of moon samples, and the completion of the Chinese navigation satellite system Beidou, which is now fully operational on a global scale. One of the most interesting recent developments within the Chinese space sector has been the governmental decision to gradually open the door to private entities, a move that has brought China more in line with the approach followed by other countries like the United States. In practice, such a decision has not only enabled private entities to slowly become active space players in terms of their ability to operate satellites, but also to launch satellites. It has also led to some important changes to the domestic regulatory framework applicable to space activities. In the past few years, a number of regulatory documents have been enacted to promote private space activities. For example, one in 2017 that regulated the manufacturing of commercial carrier, and a couple of years ago, a notice regulating the manufacturing and use of small satellites by private entities. So as you know, China doesn't have a national space law in the general understanding of this term, but as a consequence of this opening up to the private sector, more and more documents have been adopted in China to govern this process. So the body of Chinese space law is gradually expanding. So to conclude my remarks, I would like to say that if you look on a broader scale, the next step for China is to become a global leader in space. This move is certainly something that entails the ability of China to attract other countries to join Chinese projects. This is something that we are already seeing taking place in the context of the Chinese space station, where China has already announced for a number of years the intention to open up the station to foreign countries. And already now that the Chinese station is in its construction process, there are already experiments on board on behalf of foreign countries. Another area of potential cooperation is the plan to build a lunar research base on the south pole of the moon, a process that should start in the late 20s, early 30s. Obviously, this is a project that China is undertaking together with Russia, so we will see how the situation will evolve in that context and whether or not countries will be willing to join that process. But in any case, I think it's important to say that China is trying to become a global space leader and is showing signs that it is moving in that direction. So, thank you. I think that's what I would like to say.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Dr. Tronchetti. So many activities with China, as we were all expecting. Yeah. Very, very exciting to hear. Dr. Kaul, is your connection stable enough? If so, please feel free to advance to your opening statement. And if you drop out, do not worry, we are patient.
All right. So thank you very much, Jess and Stefan, for putting it all together It's quite exciting. For me, of course, it's my normal start for the day because I do my yoga in the morning. So 5 o'clock waking up is not a problem. In any event, as far as India is concerned, of course, India is counted as one of the big 6 in space. I mean, the big 6 agencies globally. Our space program, perhaps the only one, started and remains a civil space program. And the reason for that is that after independence, India became independent from the colonial power in 1947. The leadership was inspired by the various international events, whether it was the geospatial year or the launch of the first military communication satellite and the first international ballistic missile in 58. But also noted that the superpowers actually seem to place value in the mechanism offered by the United Nations, which is built on consensus-making rule. And so 10 years later, we have the Outer Space Treaty, which every one of the countries here has been a beneficiary of. And so hopefully, I'm hearing the future plans that Japan has and China has, and for sure India has, as do others, will be able to take it forward because everybody can use space. Be that as it may, so it was determined that what we needed to do is to deploy space technology and applications for socio-economic development. India is a very, very vast country, and like most other countries that have been subject to colonial rule, there was a great deal of work to be done in those areas. You needed to connect and get the country together. So the first 10 years of the Indian space program was focused on technology independence. So orbit class launch vehicles, satellites, ground stations, and the aim of the exercise was satellite communications, remote sensing, meteorology, the whole range. By 1980, India had launched the first satellite on its own vehicle, and that really propelled India into an elite club, if you like. And since then, the National Space Program has, it has made some waves. For example, you fast forward to 2013 with the Mangalyaan. And typically what it has been is budget constraints that have been a standing feature of the Indian space program. So frugal engineering, Spartan budgets, and really to get on with the job in the least possible expense and maximum utilization. We simply don't have the financial ability to be trying something, then chucking it out, and then coming right back to the drawing board. That doesn't work in our country. So you just got to do it right. So 2013, the Mars mission that I think shocked the world somewhat. And in 2017, for the first time, I think in the world, 104 satellites were launched on our PSLV. It has expanded gradually. And this year we have further testing, hopefully the last one, of the reusable launch vehicle. And we have this human spaceflight program and a couple of others. We're working on the new technologies as well. Now, when we talk in context to what is India's space law, like Fabio was saying, that India does not have a space law in the traditional sense of the word. There is no Space Activities Act, for example. So what we do have is, of course, a statutory framework in terms of which the Department of Space, which is the space program administrator, administers the space program as has been decided by the space establishment and the Government of India leadership. The Space Department of Space, the administrator reports directly to the Prime Minister, and there is a Space Commission institutionally that decides on the policies and the focus and approves for the programs. And ultimately, there is a Parliamentary Oversight Committee that will look into it. There will be the Public Accounts Committee. So there is a great deal of scrutiny of what happens, and ultimately responsible to be answering to the Parliament. Of course, a lot of the information is never available in the public domain for the reason that, first and foremost, I think until we did the first lunar mission, which was very successful, generally the rest of the public isn't really aware of what is happening because there's no reason to be, really. It's not in your face, publicized, advertised, anything. So for that reason, this is how it has been, this is how it is. And there are policies that have, just to take a step back, the Indian economy being a command economy, it was partially deregulated in 1990 onwards. And so through that process, telecommunications was deregulated and India introduced satellite communications in the country in 2000. In consequence of that, it was the first time that the National Space Program stepped into the role of being a commercial space service provider. So transponder capacity to private commercial satellite communication and broadcasting companies. And this continues. It continues to be provided on the INSAT capacity, which is India's communication satellite, as well as on lease capacity on foreign satellites where there is a gap that needs to be filled up. What has not happened as yet, however, is private sector being allowed to establish, launch, own, operate a satellite in space as yet. And I believe that the recent reforms which were announced, there was an announcement of it in summer of 2020, we are seeing now, and I have my expectation for reasons, that we will see now private sector being permitted to operate in space. Equally, what has happened is that by 2007, the PSLV, which is our low-cost launch vehicle, we call it the workhorse, that entered into the commercial space launch market. And indeed, it was the first satellite that was launched for a foreign client was Italy. We launched the Agile, and since then, we've gone on. So it has been a slow when we compare it to many other countries, but it has been a forward movement. And now I believe that there is going to be an expansion and deepening of engagements with the private sector, those companies, the industry, which is already connected with space, whether it is in the procurement ecosystem of the government, or indeed the new space companies that, it's a sui generis, exciting vertical that has come up, nothing to do with the national program. And quite honestly, it's amazing the kind of advocacy that they have done so fearlessly so that the government actually recognizes that they are contributing immensely to accelerated development of new technologies and so on. And so I believe that in the coming days, we will see an expansion to the private sector involvement. Thank you.
That's really amazing to hear how there's so much current development into the private sector in India. Thank you, Dr. Kaul, very, very insightful. I will hand it over to actually my co-chair, Stefan, for a follow-up question that he has for you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Kaul. With regard to the inclusion of the private sector, is there already any idea of a time frame over which this is going to happen?
Well, Stefan, actually the private sector has been engaged with the National Space Program as suppliers of specific goods and services through the public procurement system. And what will now happen, there are about 250 companies that are within that procurement ecosystem. But of them, there are, it's about 100, 150 companies, which are really the core. And there are old legacy manufacturers who are already into aerospace, as it happens. Some parts of it, as far as offset and defense procurements was concerned, the government of India had opened that. And they said that a certain percentage of the FDI, the foreign direct investment that is being brought, that project of acquiring whatever the government was acquiring would have to be linked to a certain offset involving any kind of, for example, civil aviation or any kind of manufacturing not connected with the defense. technology transfers, so on. So with the result that a large number of our core and legacy manufacturers, over 100 years old, are already involved and they have a certain capacity. And in the parallel, they have been doing the critical parts, such as building the engine or so forth, for the space as its supplier. With the result that would for sure be the one that would be involved in the deepening and expanding. And there are new space companies that are developing launch vehicles, for example. They are at the stage of a second and third, I think the third level of tests that are required to be taken. There are people building satellites. There are people building propulsion systems, which will keep it better stabilized in orbit, etc. So this, I call it the first generation because they came up 10 years ago. They will be involved, as will, I think, a great deal of opportunity with those that are recently being, the technologies that are coming up. And I believe that there will be a synergy between all of this. I would imagine when you talk about timelines, I would say when thinking about the way that India would normally progress step by step, I believe it will be the next process would have started, it has started now. It would be maybe in the next 5-6 years, we hope to see that there is a private satellite system that is up in space.
That is.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks
go
a
ahead,
lot.
Stefan.
Thanks. And if I may just follow up with an additional question there. Given that we come from very different national legal backgrounds, could you maybe say a word or two about the role of the Indian National Space Promotion and Administration Center in this overall regulatory framework?
Well, the InSpace, I think that's what you're talking about?
Yes.
Yes. So InSpace is an entity that was announced by Prime Minister to handhold, and I think the focus then was on new space companies, to handhold companies to be able to participate in space activities. The Prime Minister's announcement said all aspects of space activities, so which is telling you ground segment and space segment. That is what InSpace is. It also functions under the administrative control of the Department of Space, and an extremely highly regarded private sector personality, Dr. Goenka, Pavan Goenka, has been nominated the chairman of it. And I think that at this point in time, as the government itself has conceived of the expansion of the program in specific ways, I think that the effort now would be to translate that decision of the space administration into a policy framework or policy and procedure, let's say, so that it can be used by the private sector. And the InSpace is going to therefore facilitate the companies to get their clearances, to coordinate with other government agencies, because it is not just one license. You need to get radio spectrum and you need to get all kinds of other permission. That is what was a frequent and recurring demand of the new space companies, to say that we just don't have the bandwidth and the time to go to 5 different agencies to get 5 different permissions. So why can't we have one window clearance? And this was, I think, a response to that, as well as guiding, especially in manufacturing. There are still components that may be, imported. There is no reason for that to happen if it indeed can be adequately and properly manufactured in India. So there is an emphasis on that. Typically, space manufacturing companies, and I'm not talking of the big companies, are in the medium, micro, and small. Those are the MSME sectors. And there is a sort of focus on self-reliance in manufacturing in the space sector. So all of these are very dynamic things that will happen. And I think that the Department of Space, and of course with InSpace assisting and hand-holding these companies through the regulatory processes, all that will unfold in the coming days.
Thanks a lot.
That was very, very interesting. Thank you. And so I was wondering, since we already kind of touched on the next steps for India, if Dr. Aoki would be willing to share with us what she thinks the next steps for Japan are regarding implementing the Space Activities Act, and what largest challenges do you see associated with its implementation, Dr. Aoki?
Thank you very much, Jessica, for your very interesting and very difficult question. Yes, thank you very much. Space Activities Act, made in 2016, has broad in content, and as I said previously, that the operation of spacecraft contains most of the new kind of activities on orbit. However, for the implementation, how to make good conditions for the licensing, and more for that, its supervision, appropriate and duly supervision would be very much important. And as private actors' activities proceed, and new lessons learned, then government amend guidelines for licensing and supervisions rather often. Already several times amendment even for the operation of the satellites, for communication satellite and remote sensing satellites have been done. So the strategy of the Japanese Space Activities Act is with the development of the activity, that development and amendment of supervision provisions. And that have to be, those have to be in accordance with international law, especially about the exploration and the exploitation of Space Resources Act. That is in the distant future, but that was made for the assurance for the industries, new entrepreneurs whose financial background was not so strong, and to make sure that space activities that has to be done in the interest of the benefit of all countries are also the new frontier for the freedom. So I will stop here. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you. That was very informative. Could you kind of explain for our participants what the role of the JAXA is, the JAXA, in implementing these new regulations and in opening up the space for private actors? Do they cooperate closely with private actors?
Oh, thank you very much. Well, JAXA is not a governmental agency. JAXA is, so under the Space Activities Act, JAXA is positioned as a semi-private actor. So JAXA needs a license and permit to launch a rocket, and also for the operation of satellites. But because it's JAXA who has some most of the space capability in Japan, that conditions are slightly different. So, the first question, JAXA is a private actor who is also to be an applicant. And for your second, you said the JA such and such. Could you spell it out, please? I don't know that English name. JA.
Oh, no, I was just spelling out JAXA for those
Japan
not familiar. Yeah, so I think that answered my question. I think mostly regarding what their role is regarding private actors. So they are a private actor themselves.
Yeah,
and
I'm sorry, and because JAXA has expertise, so some JAXA officials are belong to are dispatched to the cabinet office, and they supervise, and they review to give the permission to launch a rocket, and and in addition to that, to get a launch permit. So if it's an it's an experienced rocket, and the same launch site is used. Then already some certificate has been given. So for each instance of launching, the applicant, mostly Mitsubishi heavy industry company, needs an permit where to that flight path it's to be gone. And that's all. Well, that's three kinds: low Earth orbit and geo, or beyond that. So for doing that, the licensing period is to be shortened. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I will hand it back over to Stefan. I think he has a question for Dr.
Yes.
Tronchetti.
Thanks a lot, isn't it? Dr. Tronchetti, with regard to the development of Chinese space loads, you mentioned there, of course, important leap forward that China has taken on the technological side. Now, there was recently the Chinese white paper. Does this also, from your point of view, does this also address concerns with regard to the current level of development of Chinese space law? And can we draw any conclusions from that for what the next steps will be on the domestic level?
Okay, yeah, thank you for your question. Well, I need to clarify that the white paper is not a document intended to, it has any lawmaking implication per se. It's just a policy document that highlights the future 5-year plan of China in the overall space sector, with some implication for the legal regulation, but it's just a description of what China plans to do in the upcoming 5 years and what has done in the previous 5 years. So it's basically a review and an illustration of what is going to happen. So in terms of lawmaking, is really not that relevant. What you should take into account in terms of the process of lawmaking in China, as far as the regulation of space activities is concerned, is what I was referring to in my brief introductory remarks. So while the process of drafting a comprehensive national space law is still in the making, it's still something that China has been working on for decades, for at least a decade. More practically, what you see is the enactment of dedicated small pieces of legislation that address specific issues that are urgently needed. Okay, so you have seen first an instrument regulating the manufacturing of commercial rockets, commercial carriers by private entities, how to go to make this legal, what kind of requirements should be complied with from a defense perspective, civil perspectives. Then recently on the manufacturing and operation of small satellites, which also tackles the licensing process, compliance with space debris mitigation, and so on and so forth. This is all in line with the general policy and goals of China in the space sector, which are several. But for what we are discussing, for example, China has the goal of putting in orbit a constellation of 12,000 satellites. You have a private holding company for this constellation, which is state-owned, and then you have several commercial entities that are launching small satellites that will be part of this broader constellation. So there are so many developments when we look at China, because you have development with the involvement of private entities, there are governmental plans, international cooperation. So it's really a complex scenario with multiple players involved. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. You mentioned that the progress towards a comprehensive space law has been going on for quite some time. Is this actually something that's realistic as an expectation for the future, that there will be a single act, a single legal document, or are we going to look at a future with, as it is now, a larger number of more dedicated, more specialized legal instruments?
I will say that the second option is more realistic, because drafting a comprehensive national space law in China is extremely complicated. One, because the space program is so vast. Second, because of the implication of civil and military factors. So when you are going to draft an act that regulates Chinese space activities, you have to take both dimensions into account, civil and military. So it's going to be extremely complicated to please all the involved parties. So it is more important for China to, as I was saying, addressing specific issues to facilitate the goals that they have set. And I think that is more, it's easier to do and more useful in practice.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. One more question from me for Dr. Chonketti. Are there any priorities that you think China will be tackling first regarding kind of this gradual approach of adopting regulations, whether it's civil or military?
Well, if you're talking about priorities of regulation, well, certainly it has to be on the governing this opening up to the private sector, because you always have to take into account that you are dealing with a country that has only recently opened up its door to the private sector in space activities. So this process cannot be envisioned as happening like in the West, where you are green light and everything is going to happen. Things are going to be undertaken if there is a specific green light from the government that certain activities are allowed, and that there is a specific framework that makes clear how they are going to be allowed, under which conditions, what is possible, what is not possible. So the priority is to make sure that, yes, there is involvement of the private sector, but private space activities are not going to endanger international security and national security of China, as well as the international obligation of China, and that they are consistent with the overall goal of the countries. So you cannot imagine private companies going their own way without following within the national strategy. Okay, so there's always a great level of oversight and supervision of what the private companies are doing.
Thank you, thank you. That's a great, interesting prediction. I was wondering, since we're, we have a couple interesting countries here who have strong positions and an unresolved position regarding the Artemis Accords. I was wondering if we could hear maybe from Dr. Kaul about, do you think India might join the Artemis Accords? We currently have, I believe, 16 countries who have joined. Japan is already part of them. China has expressed some opposition. What is India's position, and what has been the debate in India about joining?
Is Setsuko going to is that for Setsuko to answer?
Oh, that was for you, Dr. Kaul, but also happy to hear from Setsuko about her idea about the Artemis.
Well, as far as the Artemis Accords are concerned, I have not heard any buzz in India as yet on the subject of Artemis Accords, on how it is perceived or what they propose to do. So I really can't shed much light on it at the moment.
Yeah, not a problem. Setsuko or Dr. Aoki, would you like to share maybe something about the development, the discussion of joining Artemis, and what you expect Japan's role will be, how this will impact Japan's space activity and international collaboration?
Yeah, thank you. Well, Artemis Accord is, first of all, it's not a legally binding instrument. It's a more political and policy statement. And 80% of Artemis Accords consist of already existing established rules of international law. Of course, the new elements are provided for, especially, for instance, safety zones to avoid the potentially harmful interference. And that is a new element, and that has to be coordinated with existing international law. And now, COPIOS, Legal Subcommittee of the COPIOS, and other forums in and outside the United Nations. So if more discussions are to be continued, and with the actions, with real actions, state practice, then I hope well, more countries, hopefully, well, India and China will join Artemis Accords. And for all, well, we can develop sound, healthy, established rules of international law. And so, well, we can go proceed for the peaceful exploration and exploitation of the moon. Well, I might be a bit too optimistic under the current political situation, but well, but after all is said and done, it's state practice that will make good rules of international law. So I hope that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. Dr. Twanketi, I will let you chime in on China's position as well. And if there are any disagreements in China between legal scholars on the accords.
Oh, certainly no. First of all, I like to share the positive thinking of Professor Aoki. And it's certainly through the state practice at the end of the day will dictate how we interpret international space law and how we regulate future lunar activities. However, from the perspective of China joining the accords, that is not possible based on American law. So American legislation prevents any form of structured cooperation between China and the United States. So China joining the accords is not possible at the moment from a legal perspective. And I can also add that the Artemis program and the Artemis Accords have also led to parallel developments from the Chinese side. So China, together with Russia, has launched a parallel initiative to the Artemis program on the construction of a lunar research base, as I was saying in my remarks, which will start at the end of the 20s and the construction in the mid-30s. Of course, everything is to be seen how it will be implemented. But from a legal perspective, eventually the Chinese and Russian project would have its own legal framework. At least we can envision that. So you may well end up having two separate regimes, possibly one under the Artemis Accord, one under the Sino-Russian initiative. Obviously, there is no drafting yet in China, or certainly there is nothing publicly disclosed, but you can envision such a development. Also, it's important to say that China and Russia are willing to invite other countries to join this project. So you may have, two sides being taken on how lunar activities will be implemented and regulated. As Professor Aoki was saying, this year, COPOS is going to address more in detail the regulation of space resources utilization activities. So hopefully, countries will be able to find a common ground on how future activities on the moon, particularly those dealing with the utilization of resources, might be regulated.
Yeah, thank you. And just one follow-up to your last point. Or has there been any positioning of China on dealing with the extraction, the utilization of resources obtained in outer space? Any updates?
China has not taken steps like the American or the Japanese or other countries that have passed national space law on the utilization of resources, and has never officially recognized the legality of such extraction and utilization under international space law. The position of China, the official position is that all the activities on the moon and other celestial bodies, including those related to the use of resources, shall be consistent with international space law. And that's where they stand. So they don't go into detail into that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. If I can get back to the possibility that there would be two parallel legal regimes, one on the Artemis Accords, one coming out of the Chinese-Russian cooperation. Do you see the possibility that there would be a practical overlap with regard to the normative content? Because at the end of the day, there will be similar practical issues that will have to be dealt with. Could we essentially end up with similar rules?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Eventually, you're perfectly right. They will have to probably deal with the same real problem, real issues. So that might be a way to go, a way to find a common ground, a common understanding, particularly in the interoperability of technology, interoperability of services, rescue mission, cooperation on the scientific side. So that may be what leads, if you have two parallel programs and two parallel regimes, what could bring them together. Yeah, that's a very good point.
So there's still the hope somewhat that we still see cooperation, especially in areas challenging in so many ways as outer space. So that this might still be something that brings countries together that are at opposing ends of political spectra.
Yeah, exactly. The more challenging, the more is likely a cooperation to take place. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Kaul, is there any position by India on the right to extract resources specifically by commercial entities?
First and foremost, India would have to articulate its own position on whether they would like to engage in extraction. And I think private entities, commercial entities being permitted to extract on the moon is a little distance away. India needs to work on this very carefully. And I think that there is nothing that prohibits, or I mean, there's nothing in the thinking that prohibits or allows at the moment. Already technologies are being developed, and you know that many of these technologies can be adapted. There's a certain base, and then you progress in different directions with that same technology platform. So yes, all of these things are certainly, the technology development is happening in different ways. I can't say specifically about extraction at this very moment, but there is nothing that prevents India from proposing to extract and to partake of commercial resource mining.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. Stefan, I think you had one final question for our excellent panelists today.
Indeed, a question to all three of you, as we've already speculated a little bit about how the future could look like. How do all three of you see the next steps in your national space legislation? What's the next big project? What's the next idea that is going to be tackled? Maybe Professor Aoki, do we want to start with you?
Yeah, and well, thank you for your question. It's space traffic management, I think. Well, the detailed guidelines of on-orbit servicing were made last year. And this certainly goes in the direction of more detailed guidelines for private actors for space traffic management. So this year, I think Japan will make several guidelines about it. And of course, that has to be, developed with international law, but the contents of international law is also evolving. So this kind of guidelines will evolve. And it's for all three countries as well, I think. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Dr. Tronchetti, is it possible to predict or to estimate what would be the next step for China?
Well, I think in terms of enactment of laws or a regulatory instrument, for the time being, there is nothing in the pipeline as such, but it would be more related to the implementing the act that had been enacted a couple of years ago on a small manufacturing of small satellites and the operation of small satellites, and everything will be connected with this overall plan of constructing a network of internet from space and communication from space that involves both governmental plans and private plans. And so to see how this is going to be developed and what kind of instrument will be needed to guide this process in a better way. I think that is the area where you can expect some development, if any. Yeah.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Kaul, what's the next step or the likely next steps for India?
Yes, well, the basic framework of permitting private sector to operate in space is already in place. It has not been announced, but they have worked out on what will be, well, the first steps. Who will be eligible? What are the criteria for that? What is it that they can do? What are the different licenses they will need? And what are the parameters? That has been worked out already. And it is contained in a document that presently informs the National Space Program, the Space Administrator. And they will, the administration will now work on those specifics and then develop downstream to ultimately reach the user, which is the private company that might be wanting to do this. But they will put out, I think, soon enough, a preliminary policy or a guideline, if you like, for the users to understand that this is basically how it will be framed. These are the kind of issues that will have to be, I mean, whoever is an applicant will have to, tick all the boxes. And in due course, stage by stage, they will take it forward until it's properly a licensing system. As Setsuko was talking about now, that is a very difficult and complicated and has to be done very carefully. So the licensing, the authorization for establishing, the license for operating, and the do's and don'ts connected to that. There is a lot of discussion on everything ranging from insurance that may be required to what is to be done, call it afterlife of that satellite, if you like. All of those are subjects of discussion. Indeed, Spaceport Sarabhai, this think tank, is having a discussion on this subject tomorrow. We are hosting a webinar on all of these things. So yes, there is much activity, and I would imagine that as far as licensing, actually issuing these licenses will be at least another, like I said, 3 to 4 years away, is my estimation. Could happen earlier.
Thanks so much. And with that, I see we're almost running out of time, so I want to take the opportunity to thank all our panelists, Jess, and also the team at ASIL for making not only this session possible, but also the entire World Speak Space series. And a reminder to all the participants that the interest groups are really the heart of ASIL, so please feel more than welcome to connect through the interest groups, so the Space Law Interest Group. We're now, as mentioned earlier, also on Twitter at ASIL_SLIG. And hope we stay in touch and that there will be future opportunities for our participants and for the viewers who are watching this later to stay connected with the interest group. Thanks a lot, everybody. And with that, we conclude today's session.
Thank you, Stefan and Jess.
Thank
And bye,
you.
Setsuko, Fabio, lovely to see you.